In October '62, President Kennedy knew that the Soviets had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba and that America was in danger.
President Kennedy knew that a nuclear war would be horrible beyond imagination, and that if it ever happened, millions of Americans would live or die based on what he decided. A nuclear confrontation is any president's worst nightmare, and for John F. Kennedy, it was about to come true. The two most powerful countries in the world were ready to destroy each other, and only Kennedy was in a position to stop it. History says that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a standoff between two giant superpowers armed with nuclear weapons. But that's not the whole story. Bombs are cold, dead things. They don't have emotions, and more importantly, they don't launch themselves. The Cuban Missile Crisis was also a showdown between two extremely powerful men, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. In a 1956 speech, Khrushchev said that communism would eventually bury the free world, and some people in this country took that as a threat. Countries in the world were ready to destroy each other. At the time, it was thought that countries like the Soviet Union were out to dominate the world, that they wanted to export their economic system through military power. But Khrushchev knew that in a head-to-head nuclear fight with the U.S., his country might come out as the loser. So instead, the Soviets confronted us indirectly, here in communist Cuba, led by Fidel Castro. In 1962, the problem with Cuba wasn't just ideology, it was proximity. The street I'm walking on now is called the Malecon. It's a stretch of oceanfront highway on Havana's northern shore. Fidel Castro's office is about a mile to the south, and to the north, across this horizon, across about 90 miles of water, is the United States.
Missiles could be launched from this spot and hit the United States in minutes. Back in the 1950s, Cuba was a lot like Las Vegas is now. It had warm weather, legal gambling, big tourist hotels, and a government friendly to the U.S. By October 1962, the weather in Cuba was still warm, but everything else had changed. Back in January of 1959, Castro's rebel commandos overthrew the U.S.-backed government. Almost overnight, the vacation paradise became an enemy nation, in part because Fidel Castro made a deal with the Soviet Union.
So here's basically how that deal worked. Cuba would get things like weapons, equipment, fuel, and money from the Soviets. In exchange, the Soviets would get a base right here in Latin America, right in our backyard.
Without Soviet backing, the Cuban military was no match for the U.S. But with Soviet equipment and weapons equal to our own, the Cubans were armed and dangerous.
In the first week of October 1962, President Kennedy and his staff suspected that the Soviets might be installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. But before they could act, they needed proof, and they wouldn't have to wait too long to get it.
On October 14th, an Air Force U-2 reconnaissance plane like this one took off for a spy mission over Cuba. The pilot flew high enough to avoid being shot down, but low enough to take some pictures that would send the U.S. intelligence community into a panic. This is one of them. Those ominous-looking tubes held medium-range ballistic missiles, or MRBMs, the military term for weapons capable of hitting at least half the cities in the United States.
Up to this point, Kennedy and his staff had hoped, even prayed, that somehow the missile rumors weren't true, or that the Soviets were just bluffing. But this was no bluff.
October 16th, 1962, at 8:45 Washington time, one of Kennedy's senior advisors informed him that the evidence was indisputable. There were missiles in Cuba, ready, or almost ready, to destroy the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis was on.
Just try to imagine the pressure on President Kennedy. Should he order the military to bomb the missile sites? Should he invade Cuba? Or should he do nothing? He called a meeting of his top advisors, knowing that what they decided could save the world or destroy it.
October 16th, 1962, 11:45 a.m., the first meeting of the President's Executive Committee, or EXCOM. Among the people there, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the President's younger brother, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, one of the President's closest advisors. Monday, October 22nd, 1962.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Kennedy says that missiles are in Cuba and that we are in the line of fire. In order to stop the flow of new weapons, he also announces a naval blockade to intercept all ships on the way to Cuba. October 23rd. The news triggers an immediate run on grocery stores as people stock up on supplies they'd need in case of an attack. All across the country, Americans prepare for the worst. October 25th. At sea, the blockade is in place. In Washington, planning continues for a series of massive airstrikes against Cuba, to be followed by a possible invasion. Tension is high.
Kennedy is under intense pressure to hit Cuba, and hit hard. But if he orders an attack, he could be sending thousands of American soldiers to almost certain death. If he waits, the Soviets might launch the missiles and kill millions of innocent civilians in a nuclear holocaust. So, after all the meetings are over and all the advisors have had their say, Kennedy does something that takes a kind of courage that few people will ever know. He waits. Historians still argue over exactly what happened in those historic meetings. Most of the people who were there have long since passed on. Robert McNamara is still alive. He still remembers. And in a rare interview, he agreed to talk to me about it. Exactly how close were we to nuclear war in October 1962?
Well, we were close in the sense that they had 150-odd nuclear warheads there. And at one point, a majority of Kennedy's advisors recommended attack, not knowing the warheads were there. But had we attacked, almost surely they would have been used, and it wouldn't have been limited to warheads against American invasion forces. Our forces were not equipped with nuclear warheads. The President and I forbid the invasion plans to include the use of nuclear weapons on Cuba. But had we been faced with nuclear weapons launched by the Soviets against our invasion force, we would quickly have responded by nuclear weapons from the U.S., and where would it have ended? Who knows? Utter catastrophe.
October 27th. Through an intermediary, the Soviets back down. The next day, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announces that the weapons will be taken out. The U.S. agrees secretly to remove its missiles from Turkey, missiles that had been aimed at the Soviet Union. The U.S. military, armed and ready to invade Cuba, could stand down.
Where did you come down in this?
Well, I was in favor of the blockade. I was opposed to attack, but I was Secretary of Defense, and we prepared the alternative of invasion. We had 180,000 troops mobilized in southeastern U.S. with the ships appropriate for an invasion. The first day's airstrike would have involved 1,080 sorties. The attack plans were laid. Thank God they weren't used, and thank God those who recommended against it prevailed. I don't believe President Kennedy even had Khrushchev not announced removal of the missiles on that Sunday, the 28th, I don't believe that President Kennedy would quickly have gone to invasion. He would have sought, as I would have sought, for some alternative, some way to delay it, because the risk of invasion, it was much greater than we knew at the time, because we didn't know that nuclear warheads were there. But the risk of war, of military conflict with the Soviets, someplace across the world, was so great that he would have sought every possible means of avoiding it.
John F. Kennedy came out a winner, but he wouldn't have long to enjoy it. 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the president was assassinated in Dallas. By October 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was out as Soviet premier. He lived in obscurity until his death in 1971. In Cuba itself, not much has changed. Fidel Castro is still the boss, and he still has a grudge against the United States. And as far as we know, we've never come as close to extinction as we did in October 1962, when the world dodged a nuclear bullet.